The camera light flickered on, and in that instant, the nation watched a familiar face unravel. Kellyanne Conway leaned forward, voice cracking into a scream that rattled across living rooms. Her words weren't sharp so much as shrill, a storm of accusations hurled with the desperation of someone who had built a career on never yielding an inch. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett. She didn't flinch. She didn't even raise her hand. She simply sat in calm defiance, her eyes steady, her posture unshaken, as if the chaos exploding inches away from her could never touch her. It was the kind of contrast you couldn't script if you tried. One woman, red-faced, jabbing the air, with pointed fingers, her voice a weapon, the other, still and composed, as though silence itself could dismantle fury. Millions of viewers would later say the same thing. They couldn't look away. For years, Kellyanne Conway had made headlines by dominating the room, fast talk, sharp turns, louder than anyone else. But here, in this televised clash, her volume felt less like control and more like panic. She wanted to rattle Crockett. She wanted to reduce her to the same shouting match that had carried Conway through countless interviews. But something was different this time. Jasmine Crockett was not rattled. She wasn't even tempted. She let the noise wash past her like waves breaking against rock. And that was the spark that ignited the internet. Within minutes, clips of Conway's outburst were being replayed, looped, slowed down, dissected. But it wasn't the scream that people replayed most. It was the silence that followed. The silence of Jasmine Crockett, sitting in her power, refusing to bow to chaos. Kellyanne Conway thought she could shout down Jasmine Crockett. But what happened next left Conway stunned, and the internet in flames. Because in that pause, in that measured calm, Crockett carried something stronger than a scream. She carried truth. And when she finally opened her mouth, her words would cut sharper than any insult Conway had ever thrown. But before we get to that jaw-dropping response, let's rewind and uncover why this clash mattered so much. The setting was almost ordinary. At first glance, a polished studio, lights arranged to make everything gleam just right. A debate table where two women sat facing each other beneath the banner of prime-time television. But nothing about that night was ordinary. America was in a season of tension, split screens of protests and hearings. A country where every word from a political figure carried the weight of a national battle. In that room, it wasn't just a conversation, it was a collision course. Producers knew they had firepower on stage. Kellyanne Conway had been booked because she was a draw, a lightning rod, someone who could turn a simple question into a clash worth headlines. And she relished that role. She came in sharp, armed with sound bites, eager to dominate the airtime. But across the table was Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman already earning a reputation for her calm dissection of chaos, her ability to meet anger with precision. Viewers who knew her work understood she didn't flinch easily. In other words, it was a powder keg waiting for a spark. What made this night different wasn't just the clash of personalities, it was the timing. Conway was stepping into the studio, carrying years of baggage, the architect of spin, the defender of indefensible policies, the woman who coined the phrase alternative facts. She had built a public image on never conceding, never showing weakness, and Crockett, she represented something Conway could never embody, a new generation of leadership, grounded in lived experience, unwilling to be intimidated, unwilling to play by the old rules of shouting matches and verbal acrobatics. The tension was baked into the moment. Every camera angle captured the imbalance, the practiced performer against the patient strategist. And viewers watching at home may not have realized it yet, but they were about to see more than a political argument. They were about to see a generational clash, a cultural clash, even a moral clash play out in real time. It mattered because people were tired of being talked over, tired of leaders raising their voices louder while saying less, tired of chaos being passed off as strength. So when Conway began to scream, it wasn't just her voice people heard, it was the echo of years of spin, years of arrogance. And when Crockett sat still, people saw something they had been longing for, dignity that doesn't need to shout. The stage wasn't just lit for a debate, it was lit for a revelation. Two paths forward were sitting side by side, one that clung to the past with noise and bluster, and one that pointed toward the future with clarity and calm. Viewers had no idea they were about to witness a showdown that would echo far beyond that studio. They thought they were tuning in for another round of political theater, but what they got was a defining image of composure under fire, a moment destined to be replayed, remixed, and remembered. To understand just how high the stakes were, we need to see who Kellyanne Conway had become in the years leading to this moment. Before that night in the studio, Kellyanne Conway had already etched herself into the story of American politics. She wasn't just another operative. She was a survivor in a world that devoured even the sharpest strategists. Conway's rise had been swift, shrewd, and at times astonishing. She began as a pollster, someone who studied numbers, trends, voter moods. In the early years, she was respected for her ability to translate data into human terms, to find the story behind statistics. But as the political climate hardened and the culture of spin became king, Conway didn't just adapt, she mastered it. Her most dramatic transformation came when she aligned herself with Donald Trump. At first, she was brought in as a campaign advisor, another voice among many. But Conway's true power was not in numbers anymore. It was in her ability to fight. Where others hesitated to defend Trump's most controversial statements, Conway rushed to the front lines. She could parry hostile questions, twist narratives, and deliver sharp soundbites that dominated the news cycle. By the time Trump was elected, she wasn't just an advisor. She was the face of his defense, his most fiery champion, the one who could turn an indefensible gaffe into a headline-grabbing distraction. It was that loyalty and yielding, unblinking, that cemented her image. To some, it looked like strength. To others, it looked like distortion elevated to an art form. And therein lay the contradiction at the heart of Kellyanne Conway: loyalty laced with spin, wit infused with misdirection, strength masking a deep insecurity that could only ever be hidden by talking louder, moving faster, staying on the offensive. Nothing captured her contradictions more than the infamous phrase she gave to the world: alternative facts. It was supposed to be a clever turn, a way to reframe an embarrassing misstep. Instead, it became her legacy. With those two words, she embodied an era where truth bent under pressure, where arrogance replaced accountability, where deflection became policy. Every time she flashed that dismissive smirk, every time she rolled her eyes at an interviewer's persistence, she wasn't just sparring with the media, she was sending a message. The message was simple: I will not yield, I will not apologize, and I will not admit weakness. That dismissive smirk became her armor, and for years, it worked. She had won shouting matches, left seasoned anchors flustered, and spun her way through controversies that would have sunk lesser figures. Her ability to weaponize confidence was unmatched. In an environment where noise often triumphed over nuance, Conway thrived. But that very strength also revealed her greatest vulnerability. Because shouting matches only work if your opponent plays the same game, Conway's strategy was simple: overwhelm with words, bury the truth under soundbites, force her opponents into either silence or anger. Either way, she would claim the upper hand. But that formula had one fatal flaw: what happens when the other side refuses to play? That was the stage Conway walked onto the night. She faced Jasmine Crockett. She carried with her years of dominance, years of winning through volume and sheer audacity. She expected the same result: another opponent rattled, another clip to add to her highlight reel. But something in the air that night was different, even if Conway didn't see it yet. Her smirk was still there, her dismissiveness as sharp as ever. But it carried a weight now, the weight of a persona too familiar to the public eye. People had seen this performance before, and the repetition had dulled its power. What once looked like strength now looked like insecurity. What once seemed like what now felt like deflection. And in that studio, the old tricks were about to meet their limit. She had won shouting matches before, but this time, something was different. And across from her sat a very different kind of opponent, one Conway had not prepared for. Long before Jasmine Crockett found herself sitting across from Kellyanne Conway on live television, she had already lived through battles far greater than a televised shouting match. To understand the quiet fire behind her composure, you have to rewind to where her story began, not in the gleaming lights of a studio, but in the grit of neighborhoods, where justice often felt out of reach, and where service wasn't a career choice so much as a calling, Jasmine started her professional journey as an attorney, not the kind who chased lucrative contracts or prestige, but one who deliberately stepped into the trenches of public defense. She represented those who couldn't afford lawyers, people society often forgot, people who didn't have a voice loud enough to cut through the noise of the system. Stacked against them, day after day, she walked into courtrooms where the odds leaned against her clients, and every case forced her to sharpen her resolve. In those moments, Crockett learned a lesson that would shape her entire career. Shouting rarely changes minds. Precision does, dignity does. In the face of dismissive judges or hostile prosecutors, she discovered the strength of measured words, the power of remaining unshaken even when others tried to provoke her. Where another lawyer might have raised their voice, Crockett mastered the art of holding her ground in silence until the room remembered it had to take her seriously. Her work as an activist mirrored that same spirit. She stood shoulder to shoulder with communities demanding justice, not by trying to overshadow them, but by amplifying their voices. She organized, she listened, she showed up not for headlines, but for humanity. And when she decided to run for office, it wasn't out of ambition for power, it was out of necessity. She saw too many people with no one fighting for them at the legislative level. If the halls of power were filled with people more invested in grandstanding than governing, she would bring the courtroom calm and community grit into that chamber. Elected as a Congresswoman, Crockett carried with her not just a title, but the scars and the strength of her journey. She was not defined by the polished rehearsals of cable news punditry. She was defined by late nights preparing for trial, by conversations with mothers terrified for their sons, by the resilience that came from representing those without wealth, connections, or privilege. Every step of her path had required sacrifice. She had faced the sting of prejudice, the exhaustion of proving herself in spaces not designed for her success, and the burden of representing communities still fighting to be seen. But each struggle left her steadier, calmer, harder to shake. And that is where the contrast with Kellyanne Conway became stark. Conway's power had been built on performance, on leaning into the theatrics of political combat, on winning the optics of a moment even if it meant bending the truth. Crockett's power was built on something deeper, an unshakable grounding in truth and service. One woman thrived on being the loudest voice in the room, the other thrived on knowing that the loudest voice wasn't always the strongest. It's easy, in a world driven by soundbites and headlines, to mistake calm for weakness. But Crockett's calm was the kind forged in fire. It was the composure of someone who had endured personal attacks, systemic barriers, and political games and walked through them. Without losing her center, she had trained herself never to let noise dictate her direction. Every courtroom, every rally, every legislative debate had been practice for what would one day become a defining moment. So when she sat across from Kellyanne Conway, Crockett didn't just bring the title of Congresswoman with her. She brought the lessons of her life, the discipline of her career, and the quiet conviction that truth doesn't need to shout. Her opponents often underestimated her. They mistook her silence for hesitation, her composure for passivity. But Crockett knew something they didn't. The most devastating blows aren't always delivered with volume. Sometimes they come in the form of clarity. Sometimes the most powerful rebuttal is the one spoken so calmly that it forces the other side to hear every word. This was not just another interview for Jasmine Crockett. This was the convergence of everything she had prepared for, every sacrifice, every fight for dignity, every lesson in resilience, the cameras, the stage, the opponent. None of it intimidated her, because her past had prepared her for this exact moment, and she wasn't about to waste it. And then the cameras went live. The debate began with a question so routine it could have passed without notice. But Kellyanne Conway wasn't interested in routine. She seized it as an opening salvo, her voice rising almost immediately, words tumbling out like a flood that couldn't be contained. She interrupted, she pivoted, she accused. It was the familiar Conway arsenal, statements designed not to illuminate, but to overwhelm. Her tone climbed higher with each sentence, sharper with each jab. She jabbed the table with her finger, her body leaning forward so aggressively it seemed the chair might collapse beneath her. The volume wasn't just loud, it was suffocating, designed to dominate the space, to drown out any chance for her opponent to gather breath. This Congresswoman, Conway snapped, doesn't understand the first thing about leadership. She's reckless, dangerous, completely out of her depth. The moderators tried to interject, but Conway's rhythm was relentless. Every interruption from her side was laced with sarcasm. Every phrase stretched into a punchline. It was the performance she had perfected over years. Outalk, ouchout, outlast. But across the table, Jasmine Crockett was a portrait in contrast. She sat poised, hands folded neatly, eyes fixed on Conway with a gaze so steady it was unnerving. While Conway's voice rattled with agitation, Crockett's silence grew louder by the second. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't clench her jaw. She simply waited, letting the storm rage around her like a tree rooted against the wind. For viewers at home, the tension was unbearable. Some felt the secondhand embarrassment of watching someone unravel on live television. Others leaned closer, waiting for Crockett's reply. The split-screen image captured it perfectly. One side chaotic, flailing, trying to force control. The other side still, unbothered, commanding the room without speaking a single word. The micro-expressions told the story better than words. Conway's face flushed, her brows tightening, lips curling with every insult. The louder she grew, the more the cracks in her composure began to show. She laughed at her own lines too quickly, smirked with desperation, and blinked more often than usual, a flicker of insecurity, betraying itself behind the bluster. Crockett, by contrast, was deliberate. Her eyes did not dart, they locked on. Her breathing was measured, shoulders squared. At moments, she tilted her head just slightly, as though studying Conway the way a lawyer studies a witness about to trip over their own testimony. Even the faintest smile ghosted across her lips once or twice, not mocking, but signaling something more dangerous: patience. Every second of restraint added weight to the moment. Crockett's silence became less about waiting her turn and more about strategy, each pause tightening the coil of anticipation. Viewers could feel it, the sense that something was building, that this was not just Conway's outburst but the prelude to something bigger. Conway, however, was blind to it. She mistook Crockett's quiet for weakness, interpreting it as hesitation. Emboldened, she leaned in further, her words dripping with contempt. "See, nothing to say. That's what happens when you're exposed on national television. You can't even defend yourself." Her voice cracked slightly at the end, but she pushed harder, determined to fill the silence with her own narrative. The moderators glanced at Crockett, almost inviting her to respond, but she didn't move. The room grew taut, like a wire stretched to breaking point. Conway had spent herself in the storm, and the audience could sense she was seconds away from overplaying her hand. The imbalance was clear. The more she shouted, the smaller she looked, and the quieter Crockett remained, the more commanding her presence became. The moment was cinematic, not because of what was being said, but because of what wasn't. A nation sat in front of their screens, pulses quickening, waiting for the inevitable. The eruption had come from Conway, but the real impact, the one people would remember, was still loading, hovering on the edge of Crockett's lips. And just when Conway thought she'd rattled her opponent, Jasmine leaned into the microphone. The room hung on a knife's edge. The air felt thick, stretched taut by Conway's relentless barrage. Her voice still echoed faintly as she leaned back in her chair, smirk tugging at the corners of her lips, convinced she had landed the final blow. But then, Jasmine Crockett shifted, not much, just a lean forward, chin steady, hands folded on the table. The faint scrape of her chair against the studio floor was louder in that moment than all of Conway's shouting. The moderators stilled, the cameras zoomed. Viewers at home, millions of them, instinctively leaned in closer to their screens. Everyone could sense it. Something was about to happen. Crockett paused. She didn't rush, didn't let Conway's noise dictate her tempo. She inhaled slowly, glanced once at the moderator, and then fixed her eyes squarely on Conway. The silence stretched, almost uncomfortably long. In that pause, the power shifted. The room no longer belonged to the woman who screamed the loudest. It belonged to the woman who could command it with quiet. And then Crockett spoke. Her voice was calm, almost measured, but it carried like steel cutting through glass. Kellyanne. She began, deliberately choosing the first name, stripping away titles, addressing her not as the power player she imagined herself to be, but as someone who, in this moment, had revealed only bluster. You've made a career out of talking over people. You've shouted down journalists, you've drowned out critics, and you've spun so many stories that sometimes even you forget which version you're telling. But here's the difference between you and me. I don't need to shout to tell the truth. The smirk vanished from Conway's face, if only for a second. Her eyes blinked rapidly. Tell the cameras caught instantly. Crockett pressed on, each word deliberate. When you coined alternative facts, that wasn't clever, it was a confession. A confession that you knew the truth wouldn't serve you, so you had to invent one. And now, here you are again, screaming, because deep down you know something you can't admit on air. Your noise isn't strength, it's fear. The audience, previously tense with discomfort, let out a ripple of gasps. The moderators exchanged a quick glance, one nearly biting his lip to stifle his reaction. Conway opened her mouth as if to interrupt, but Crockett's tone steady, unflinching, rolled over her attempt like a tide drowning out a pebble. Crockett leaned in closer, voice lowering slightly, which only made the microphones catch every syllable with sharper clarity. See, I was raised to believe that dignity doesn't require volume, that service means listening more than shouting. And I've spent my career standing beside people who don't have the luxury of being loud, people who need someone calm, enough, steady enough to cut through chaos and get to the truth. That's what I'm doing right now. The camera cut to Conway, her jaw tight, eyes darting as though searching for her next line of defense. But the usual tricks, the dismissive smirk, the rolling eyes looked hollow under the weight of Crockett's composure. Crockett wasn't finished. You can scream at me all night if you want, Kellyanne. But understand this, your volume doesn't erase my record. My work is in black and white, in courtrooms, in legislation, in communities that actually know my name because I showed up for them. That's the difference. You spin stories. I live them. The words landed like strikes in a match. The crowd watching from the studio let out a low murmur, followed by a swell of applause that producers hadn't anticipated. Moderators tried to hush them, but it was too late. The energy in the room had shifted completely. Conway sat frozen, the muscles in her face twitching as though her body couldn't decide whether to sneer or scowl. She attempted another interruption, but Crockett's calm pace left no gaps to wedge into. Every second Conway remained silent only made her look smaller. Crockett's closing was a masterstroke of restraint. She let the audience hang for a moment, then delivered the final blow with surgical precision. So, the next time you think shouting makes you strong, remember this: strength is proven in composure. And tonight, everyone watching knows the difference. Silence, the kind of silence that doesn't come often in live television. Moderators stared, one with his hand hovering over his notes as if he had forgotten how to read them. The cameras captured Conway's blinking, the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her smirk had collapsed into something resembling defeat. Then, all at once, the studio erupted. Gasps, whispers, applause, chatter. It was as if the audience, both in the studio and across the nation, had been holding their breath, and Crockett had given them permission to exhale. In real time, the ripple effects began. Phones lit up in the audience, fingers racing across screens as clips were recorded and uploaded within seconds. Twitter feeds surged with the moment. Crockett just ended Conway. Calm greater than chaos. Mic dropped within minutes. Hashtags began to trend. Back in the studio, Conway sat rigid, still trying to recover, still trying to pull together a retort. But the damage was done. The moment wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to Crockett, to the silence she had commanded, to the precision she had delivered. Even the moderators seemed struck, struggling to redirect the debate. One cleared his throat awkwardly before asking the next question, his voice cracking slightly from the tension. But it didn't matter. The battle had already been decided. The audience had witnessed not just a counterpoint, but a dismantling. Jasmine Crockett had just proven the timeless truth. Dignity dismantles fury. And the image of her leaning calmly into the microphone, while Conway blinked and faltered, was seared into the memory of everyone watching. But the real explosion wouldn't happen in the studio. It erupted online, the moment Jasmine Crockett leaned into that microphone. The debate stopped being just another cable news spectacle and instantly transformed into cultural currency. Within minutes of the broadcast, clips of her takedown began circulating across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, spreading like wildfire. The framing was unanimous: calm versus chaos. Conway's screeching face, frozen mid-yell, was paired against Crockett's steady, composed gaze, side by side. The images told a story more powerful than any headline could write. On Twitter, X, hashtags took off with a speed usually reserved for breaking scandals. Hashtag ComScouse trended at #1 within the hour. Hashtag Crockett Strong followed close behind. Users reposted the clip with captions like, "This is how you dismantle a bully," and "Kellyanne brought noise. Jasmine brought truth." Memes flourished. Conway's screaming face edited into hurricanes, tornadoes, and firestorms while Crockett sat unmoved like a mountain in the background. Another meme simply said, "Volume is not victory." TikTok users added dramatic music overlays to Crockett's mic drop moment, turning it into cinematic edits. Teenagers remixed her pause before speaking into slow motion, captioning it, "Patience is power." By morning, the clip had racked up millions of views, and people who had never watched a political debate in their lives were sharing it on their feeds. Headlines mirrored the online frenzy. The New York Times ran, "Jasmine Crockett stuns in televised showdown." The Washington Post's headline read, "Composure versus chaos, Crockett's calm response goes viral." Even outlets typically hostile to progressive voices couldn't ignore it. One conservative site admitted, Conway outshined in live clash. The validation layer only grew stronger as celebrities and commentators joined the chorus. Ava DuVernay tweeted, "Strength isn't screaming, it's standing steady." Crockett embodied that tonight. Comedian Hazenman High joked on Instagram, "Kellyanne brought alternative facts, Crockett brought alternative calm." MSNBC hosts replayed the moment on loop, while late-night comedians turned Conway's tirade into monologues about insecurity. Dressed up as strength, for Conway, the ridicule was merciless. Her dismissive smirk once her trademark became the butt of endless parodies. One viral TikTok stitched her scream into a car alarm, looping until Crockett's calm reply cut it off. Like silence restoring order, the internet had collectively decided Conway looked like the past, Crockett looked like the future. But for Jasmine Crockett, the elevation was profound. Commentators described her as a new symbol of dignity under fire. Editorials painted her as the antidote to an era defined by shouting heads and scorched earth politics. For communities often dismissed or silenced, her composure felt like representation that mattered. It was proof that you could meet aggression without mimicking it, that strength wasn't measured in decibels but in resolve. Even everyday people joined in. Teachers told their students about the exchange. Activists posted clips with captions like, "This is what leadership looks like." Parents shared it with their children as an example of staying calm when bullied. The resonance wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. Crockett had modeled something people longed to see in their own lives, grace that could outlast arrogance. Meanwhile, Conway found herself drowning in the backlash. Cable news replayed her tirade with pundits dissecting how her performance backfired. She tried to spin it in follow-up interviews, insisting she wasn't rattled, that she had won the exchange. But the smirk she wore now seemed defensive, brittle. Online, the consensus was already cemented. It didn't matter what she said after. The image of her yelling while Crockett sat calm had already become the story. In living rooms across the country, families rewatched the clip. In workplaces, people huddled around phones, replaying Crockett's words like an anthem. On college campuses, students debated the deeper meaning, what it meant for women in politics, for leaders of color, for anyone who had ever been told to stay quiet while others shouted over them. Jasmine Crockett had crossed a threshold. She wasn't just a congresswoman anymore, she had become a cultural figure, a shorthand for composure, a viral embodiment of dignity. And yet, beneath the jokes and memes, there was something deeper at play. When the dust settled and the clips finished ricocheting across every corner of the internet. One truth rose higher than all the noise. Jasmine Crockett's calm wasn't just a debating tactic. It was a statement, a mirror held up to an era, defined by shouting. What she did that night was bigger than a rebuttal to Kellyanne Conway. It was a reminder that truth does not need to be loud to be powerful, and dignity does not need theatrics to shine. Think about what unfolded on that stage. One woman weaponized volume, hoping that anger would intimidate, that repetition could replace reason. The other chose patience, silence, and precision. It was more than two political figures colliding. It was two visions of leadership on display. One rooted in arrogance, the other in resilience. One built on distortion, the other on truth. And it mattered because people are tired. Tired of seeing arrogance celebrated as strength. Tired of lies disguised as cleverness. Tired of a political culture where those who shout the loudest often drown out those with something worth saying. Crockett didn't just dismantle Conway's fury. She dismantled the illusion that shouting equals power. In an era of shouting, silence can be the sharpest blade. That was the moral etched into millions of minds as they replayed her reply. She proved that a steady voice can cut through chaos more effectively than the sharpest insult. She proved that dignity is not passive, it's active, it's intentional. It's revolutionary in a world addicted to spectacle. Her response resonated so deeply because it wasn't confined to politics. It was universal. Every person who had ever been shouted over in a meeting, every student who had ever been mocked for staying quiet, every immigrant who had ever been told their accent made them lesser, all of them saw themselves in Jasmine Crockett. Calm under fire, unshaken by chaos, unwilling to yield their dignity to noise. She modeled resilience not as something abstract, but as something lived, something possible. And in that modeling, she gave people permission to believe again in a different kind of power. A power that doesn't rely on distortion, but on clarity. A power that doesn't need arrogance to command respect. A power that says, the truth is enough. Kellyanne Conway's tirade will fade. It will blur into the long list of outbursts, spin cycles, and performances that defined her career. But Jasmine Crockett's composure will linger, because it reminded us of something timeless. Chaos is loud, but dignity endures. Fury burns hot, but truth outlasts it. That is why the clip was replayed not just as entertainment, but as inspiration. It wasn't just that Crockett won a debate, it was that she embodied something millions of people long for in their leaders and in themselves. The belief that you can face arrogance and not bend, that you can stand in truth and outlast the noise. Millions saw themselves in Crockett, calm under fire, unshaken by chaos. And that is why her words, her silence, her presence will be remembered long after the shouting fades. And that brings us to the final question. What do we take from this moment? Kellyanne Conway screamed. Jasmine Crockett stayed calm. And in that unforgettable moment, dignity defeated fury for all the world to see. The video title says it all. Conway tried to shout her down, but Crockett's steady reply became the story millions couldn't stop replaying. This wasn't just political theater. It was a glimpse of what real leadership looks like. Conway's outburst, all noise and no weight, collapsed under its own emptiness. Crockett's composure, by contrast, revealed the strength of truth carried with dignity. She didn't need to match anger with anger. She didn't need to raise her voice. She simply let the power of clarity speak for itself, and it echoed far beyond that studio. And that's the lesson. Noise can grab attention, but it cannot sustain respect. Arrogance can dominate a moment, but it cannot define the future. Only resilience, composure, and truth have that kind of staying power. Jasmine Crockett showed us that calm isn't weakness. It's the sharpest, strongest answer to chaos. So now it's up to us. If you believe that composure beats chaos, that dignity outlasts arrogance, and that truth deserves to be louder than lies, then this is the space for you. Subscribe, share, and be part of a movement that refuses to let stories like this get buried. Because every time someone like Jasmine Crockett stands calm in the storm, it's not just a win for one debate, it's a reminder that we, too, can hold our ground, speak our truth, and outlast the noise. Stay inspired, stay steady, and remember, in the end, calm always wins.